Imagine losing everything overnight, your home, your savings, your future. Most people would give up. But one man in Seattle discovered that surviving isn't about food or shelter. It's about mastering your own mind. This is his story of fear, isolation, and the strength it takes to refuse to break. The morning in Seattle felt ordinary. The streets were alive with the familiar rhythm of commuters, the hiss of bus brakes, the clatter of coffee cups, and the chatter of hurried voices. But for Daniel Reed, 34, everything had already fallen apart. He had built his life carefully, saving every extra dollar, working long hours at a mid-level marketing firm, dreaming of stability. He had a small apartment he loved, a modest car, and the illusion that hard work guaranteed safety. That illusion shattered in a single, heart-stopping moment. Daniel had opened his email to see a notice he had feared but tried to ignore. His bank account had been drained due to a cyber attack on his employer, wiping out his salary, his savings, everything he had set aside for emergencies. Panic hit first, a hot choking wave that made his chest tighten. Then came the cold, hollow realization. He could no longer pay his rent. He would be evicted. Holding the eviction notice in trembling hands, Daniel staggered to the window of his tiny apartment, looking out at the city he had always felt part of. Now it looked alien. The skyscrapers, the crowded streets, even the distant mountains seemed to mock him. Fear gripped him like an iron fist, his mind racing with questions. How had it come to this? What would he do? Where would he sleep? He tried to call his parents, but they lived across the country and had their own problems. Friends were sympathetic but distant, unwilling to help beyond a quick coffee or a few encouraging words. Daniel wandered the streets, carrying a small backpack with the few possessions he could salvage. He passed cafes with the aroma of fresh pastries, offices full of people laughing over conference calls, and families with children in strollers, blissfully unaware of the storm consuming him inside. Daniel's panic was a storm of the mind. Anxiety twisted his thoughts, making simple decisions feel impossible. His stomach knotted at the idea of sleeping outside. His head throbbed with fear of rejection, humiliation, and failure. But somewhere beneath the panic, a faint voice whispered, "Survival begins with the mind." He realized that food, shelter, and money mattered, but his ability to think clearly, to make choices, and to endure mentally would be the true test. That first night, Daniel found a corner of his car in an abandoned parking lot. He curled up on the seat, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the city, feeling completely invisible. Sleep was elusive. The mind replayed every regret, every what-if, amplifying them like an echo chamber. But in the darkness, he discovered the first lesson of survival. Fear is only as strong as your focus allows it to be. Clinging to this fragile awareness, Daniel closed his eyes, not knowing what tomorrow would bring, but promising himself he would face it. The world outside was indifferent, but Daniel's battle had begun. Survival wasn't just about keeping the body alive. It was about protecting his mind from collapsing under the weight of reality. And tonight, in the quiet hum of a sleeping city, the first chapter of his psychological survival had begun. The first days living out of his car were surreal. The streets of Seattle, once familiar and comforting, had become a maze of fear and discomfort. Every glance from a passerby felt like judgment. Every honk of a horn made his chest tighten. Daniel had traded a small, safe apartment for a metal box on wheels, and the weight of loneliness pressed on him harder than the cold autumn air. Isolation was more than physical. The real challenge came from within. Without the distractions of work, friends, or routines, his thoughts grew loud and persistent. Daniel found himself replaying every mistake, obsessing over what he could have done differently. The mind, once a trusted tool, had become an unrelenting tormentor. Anxiety whispered constantly, "You're failing. You're invisible. You'll never recover." He started talking to himself almost as if negotiating with an invisible partner. "Tomorrow I'll figure something out," he'd mutter before sleep, then lie awake staring at the ceiling of his car, counting the faint lights of distant buildings. Sleep was a fragile, fleeting visitor. Dreams were often nightmares, memories of lost opportunities, imagined rejections, and faces of people who had abandoned him. But in this harsh solitude, Daniel began to notice something unexpected. His mind could adapt. He realized that survival wasn't just about finding food or shelter. It was about learning to endure mental pressure without breaking. Each morning he forced himself out of the car, walking through the city streets observing life without judgment. He watched strangers laughing over coffee, couples holding hands, children playing in parks. Each scene reminded him that life moved forward, indifferent to his suffering, and that he had a choice: succumb or survive. He discovered small routines that anchored him. A cup of free coffee from a shelter in the morning, a few pages of a borrowed book from the public library, a walk along the waterfront letting the gray waves wash over his anxiety. These rituals were insignificant to anyone else, but to Daniel they were lifelines, tiny acts of normalcy in a life that had been uprooted. Evenings were hardest. The city fell silent and the darkness amplified his fears. He shivered in his jacket, huddled in the back seat of his car, imagining threats in every shadow. But he clung to a growing realization: the mind could be trained like a muscle. Every night he endured, every day he kept moving, strengthened his ability to face despair without surrendering. By the end of the week, Daniel understood that isolation wasn't just a punishment, it was a teacher. It forced him to confront the parts of himself he had ignored, his fears, his weaknesses, and most importantly, his capacity for resilience. Alone, invisible, and terrified, he had taken the first real step in psychological survival. Weeks had passed, and Daniel's body had grown accustomed to the physical hardships of life on the streets. Cold nights, skipped meals, and cramped sleep in the back of his car had become routine. But it was the hunger of the mind that gnawed at him most deeply. He could scavenge food, find temporary warmth, and navigate the streets, yet no amount of physical survival seemed to satisfy the emptiness within. His thoughts were relentless. Why did this happen to me? Why now? Anxiety clung to him, whispering constantly that he was weak, that his efforts were meaningless, that the world had already moved on without him. At times, the hopelessness was suffocating, a weight pressing down on his chest, making every movement feel like swimming through thick mud. Daniel realized that surviving on the streets wasn't just a test of the body, it was a battle for mental endurance. Determined not to let despair claim him, Daniel turned to the one resource still available: his mind. He began reading every book, article, and pamphlet he could find at public libraries and free community centers, teaching himself the psychology of survival. He learned about mindfulness, cognitive reframing, and the power of self-talk. Each new concept was a tool, a shield against the relentless fear and doubt that threatened to overwhelm him. He practiced breathing exercises, focusing on the rhythm of his lungs to anchor himself in reality. When panic rose, he repeated affirmations silently: "I am still here. I am still capable. I will not surrender." He realized that fear only had power if he allowed it to paralyze action, and slowly, the chaotic swirl of thoughts began to feel more manageable. Yet even with these mental strategies, moments of despair were inevitable. Daniel often found himself sitting alone by the waterfront, watching the gray waves crash against the pier, feeling invisible among the countless lives moving past him. Sometimes he would break down, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks, grief for the life he had lost mingling with fear of the life he might never regain. But in those moments, he also discovered something extraordinary. Resilience could be forged in suffering, and clarity could emerge from pain. By the end of each day, Daniel reminded himself that survival wasn't measured by material gain, but by the mind's ability to endure. Every night spent awake in the car, every day navigating the indifferent city, was a lesson in strength. Slowly, he began to recognize that hunger wasn't just for food, it was for hope, for purpose, for connection. And while the world had stripped him of stability, it had inadvertently granted him the one tool no one could take away: the ability to control his mind, to fight despair, and to endure against all odds. Months had passed and Daniel had grown used to the rhythm of survival, yet something was missing. The streets of Seattle could teach resilience, endurance, and self-discipline, but they could not fill the emptiness that gnawed at his mind. Isolation had sharpened his instincts, strengthened his coping mechanisms, and forced him to master his fear. But humans were not meant to endure alone. Daniel began to realize that connection, even the smallest kind, was essential for psychological survival. It was on a drizzly afternoon at a local shelter that he first met Lisa. She was a volunteer, calm and observant, moving from person to person with quiet patience. When she handed him a warm cup of soup, her eyes held more than professionalism. They held understanding. No pity, no judgment, just recognition that he was human and that his struggles mattered. For the first time in months, Daniel felt seen. Lisa taught him something subtle but profound. The mind survives not only by avoiding destruction, but by seeking purpose. Even small acts of kindness, offering a smile, helping someone carry groceries, sharing advice, could anchor him, giving him something beyond mere survival to hold on to. She encouraged him to participate in the shelter's daily routines, not as a guest but as someone contributing. Daniel hesitated at first, unsure if he had anything to offer. But slowly, he began to realize that even in brokenness, he still had value. With every interaction, Daniel noticed a shift. Conversations with other shelter guests, volunteers, and neighbors became more than social niceties. They were reminders that life still had color, that hope could be shared. He learned the subtle psychology of connection, how empathy could restore calm, how listening could reduce isolation, how a simple smile could reverse despair. Even fleeting encounters became lifelines, threads in the fragile web holding his mind together. One evening, Daniel helped a young man navigate the paperwork for a job application. As he guided him through each step, he realized he was no longer just surviving, he was creating meaning. Every word of encouragement, every patient explanation was an act of psychological defiance against the despair that had once consumed him. Connection, he understood, was not a luxury. It was a necessity as vital as food, shelter, or warmth. By the end of the month, Daniel had found a rhythm that balanced solitude and interaction, fear and hope. The world outside remained indifferent, unpredictable, and often cruel, but he had discovered a powerful truth. The mind does not endure in isolation. It thrives in connection, in purpose, in shared humanity, and with each bond, each small act of empathy, Daniel fortified the one thing no hardship could steal, his sense of self. Winter was approaching, and the city of Seattle seemed colder, grayer, and more unyielding than ever. Yet for Daniel Reed, the harsh streets that had once threatened to crush him had become a proving ground. Months of struggle, fear, and solitude had forged something unexpected, a mind sharpened by adversity, a resilience he hadn't known he possessed, and a sense of purpose grounded in connection. That morning, Daniel walked along the waterfront, the damp air biting at his cheeks. He had no apartment, no permanent job, and no guarantees, but he felt a sense of control he had never experienced before. For the first time, he realized that survival was not about returning to the life he had lost. It was about mastering the one thing no one could take from him, his mind. Daniel had become a mentor of sorts at the shelter, quietly guiding newcomers through paperwork, sharing strategies for coping with fear and anxiety, and simply listening when others needed to be heard. Every smile he offered, every word of encouragement reinforced his own sense of agency. Through helping others, he discovered that psychological survival was not just personal, it was communal. Connection, empathy, and purpose were the antidotes to despair. He also learned to embrace the uncertainty that had once terrified him. Each day without a permanent home became a lesson in adaptability. Daniel had cultivated the ability to observe his own thoughts without being overwhelmed, to respond to fear with strategy rather than panic, and to find calm amidst chaos. His internal dialogue had transformed from self-reproach to self-affirmation. I am here. I endure. I am capable. One afternoon, as he watched children laughing at a nearby park, Daniel realized he was no longer invisible, even if the world still seemed indifferent. His survival had been psychological, yes, but it had also been profoundly human. He had endured the nights of loneliness, the hunger and the fear, and in doing so, he had discovered the power of resilience, hope, and purpose. By winter's first snowfall, Daniel had made small but meaningful strides. He had secured a part-time job, rebuilt some savings, and developed routines that anchored him mentally and emotionally. But more importantly, he had learned the enduring lesson of his journey. Survival is not measured by material recovery alone. It is measured by the mind's ability to withstand despair, adapt to adversity, and continue to engage with life meaningfully, no matter how bleak the circumstances. As he walked through the snow-dusted streets that had once felt hostile and unwelcoming, Daniel smiled. He did not have everything he had lost, but he had found something far more vital: mastery over his own mind, the courage to continue, and the awareness that survival, above all, begins from within. Daniel's journey shows that survival isn't just about finding food, shelter, or money. It's about the mind. In the darkest moments, when fear and loneliness seem unstoppable, the greatest strength comes from resilience, hope, and connection. He didn't just endure, he learned to thrive even when the world was indifferent. And his story is a reminder. No matter how broken life feels, your mind can be your most powerful tool for survival.